I come back to this lowly thought of species that we all secretly, if we're like talking to our closest bonsai friends, we're like, I don't get why everybody craps on procumbens. Like, I like it. I do too. They look great. They're easy to manage. They kind of behave. Yeah, right? This is that. But then when you're in like the bonsai public, you're like, procumbens, it's like a ready-made bonsai. It's kind of, too much. This is an amazing species, right? I'll get off my soapbox. I've done this multiple times. I won't do it today. Spring work on a procumbens, really looking at, and when we dive in, we talked about this on the pruning of the California juniper. Procumbens is a scaled juniper. It is a scaled juniper. It definitely is a mounding scaled juniper. They just happen to sit in juvenile foliage more commonly, but even on this tree. Now this is that contrast, and I know it's pretty small, but you see the scale foliage here, you see the juvenile foliage below it. This is an area just being vigorous, just being healthy, just being allowed to grow. That's when procumbens will revert back to its mature foliage. Now when we talk about that reversion, the second that we clean, we prune, we wire, the moment that we touch a procumbens, it has the higher propensity to exist in juvenile foliage. It goes back to juvenile foliage, and for me, I would just rather keep the juvenile foliage. It behaves very well. It has shorter internodes. Generally, it has buds on the interior, and that's the discussion that we're going to talk about. How do we handle this in the spring? And again, coming back to the notion, talking about that scale, coming back to the California juniper, spring work on junipers, or juniper handling of the foliage in general, the bigger the push you give the tree, the bigger the response it gives back. And most of us neglect our procumbens until they're too overgrown. We come back in, we cut them way back, and all of a sudden, the tree pushes out again, and we say, God, I cut the thing, it explodes, they're a pain in the ass. No. The goal with bonsai is to get procumbens to a point where the container size is controlling the amount of energy, and where our actions inside of this highly ramified, reduced proportion foliar mass are so small that we make an action, open up space, clean, prune, do all of the things we need to do, but the tree just gives us that tight, compact growth and not that big explosion. You cut off a lot, you get a lot in return. You cut off a little bit, or you cut off strategic, you get much less in return. We're looking for less as we refine. And in an exhibition, if I were looking at a procumbens juniper, I would be looking at characteristics entirely different than what I would be looking for in a Sabina, in a Shimpaku, in a Rocky Mountain juniper. I would be looking for a different level of craftsmanship, showing that notion and knowledge and attention to detail that procumbens have. This was my very first bonsai tree. 12 years old, this is it. This is where it started for Ryan Neal. The fact that it survived, shocking and possibly amazing that I didn't kill it, but the once around, and this is a tree that I've tried to sell, I've tried to give away, I've definitely tried to kill multiple times, and the thing has stuck around, and now I'm determined to just give it the best treatment, because this has been the beginning and continues to be a major part of my bonsai career. Okay, so we've continued to refine. We talked about this on the BSOP series live at Bonsai Society of Portland in 2017. We at that point, it hadn't been reworked. We've used it in marketing campaigns. We've been refining and refining and refining this design. So coming back to this spring work, we're going to be talking about refinement today, right? And again, I'm trying to, now that I've gotten a tree to be this dense and to be this ramified, my goal isn't to cut it all off. It is not to cut it all off. I want to open up space. I want to be cleaning up the bottom of the pad, right? You see here these pieces, and you can see all of that unkept stuff that exists along here. I want to come back and I want to be making firm decisions where I'm keeping as much of the ramification intact as I possibly can, but I am taking off of those bottom pieces. And sometimes we're going to get woody lignified branches that, for whatever reason over the course of time, have kind of gravitated away and outside of that silhouette that we're going to have to make decisions on as well. But for the most part, when we're coming along the bottom of these pads, I'm generally able to just use my fingertips on these green stems and just pull towards the tip to be cleaning that off. This is not anything new in terms of juniper cleaning, but I want to be taking that all the way to the interior, because again, this is a refined tree. We want to maintain density, but even my interior ramification, you see this branch that sits in here, notice the foliar load that's on that branch. Well, that branch sitting on top of this is oftentimes what encourages us to want to prune this. Don't prune this. This is tight, this is compact. Come back into these interior branches and start pulling off these pieces that are on the bottom that are starting to elongate quite a bit more than the rest of the foliar mass, and really buy that space by cleaning out these pieces that aren't usable. And that starts to, you can kind of see it, just kind of starts to create some beautiful breathability right there. You see that the spacing that exists in there. This is what we're talking about. Now, a lot of times when we talk juniper cleaning, people also talk about coming back in and cleaning out all of the crotches. And I want to come back in, and instead of thinking necessarily about crotches, because there is some crotch growth that's going to allow us to compress and compact the tree, I want to be thinking about cleaning off either weak interiors that are kind of flopping around, some of these smaller pieces right at the base of some of my stronger pieces of ramification, cleaning those out. I don't necessarily want to just go in and nuke all of the crotch growth, because that crotch growth, we need to think intelligently about that crotch growth. It may be the replacement, a stronger, better, more ramified, more compact piece that can replace some of the longer, leggier tips that exist on Procumbens juniper as they continue to age and mature. Okay, I like to take off any elongating tips that are starting to elongate, and then I like to come into these pieces. This interior piece right here growing very vertical, and I like to cut it. If I have good, strong, nice, ramified growing interior pieces here, and I can't zoom anymore on the camera, I do apologize. Okay, now we're cleaning a lot, we're talking about checking ourselves to not get back to that point where big action, big response. I don't want to continue to think that my goal is to reduce this, but what I have gotten, I'm going to rotate in camera here, what I've got is I've got space. I have space. I've bought myself space. I've got airflow moving through here, cleaning off the bottoms, cleaning off those weak interiors. I've compressed because I've pruned back that tip and just gotten that tip, and I see I missed a bottom over here, bottom or two. And you notice how that gives it that nice, clean, perky feel. I like that. I've got a little bit of a pointed tip, small cut back here. Watch this. I'm grabbing the tip. Boom, I'm grabbing just that tip. I'm cutting to the first internode that's going to transition 1 to 2, and that's the extent of what I'm cutting, not necessarily across the entire tree. There will be areas I will cut more, but that's the kind of density that I'm looking for as the refined position that Procumbens sits in. And what you're probably saying at home, or what you're probably recognizing is, oh wow, I'm taking off a lot. Like, I'm taking off a lot more. I thought we needed to open it up. I thought it was going to be detrimental to the tree to have it be so compact. If we're cleaning off those bottoms, and not just cleaning off the bottoms on a single branch, but cleaning off the bottoms on each of the pieces of secondary and tertiary ramification that have woody lignified structure and is contributing to that density, that is that major move. The weak interiors, major move. And then we start reducing the elongated pieces, and all of a sudden we're working from both sides, and we start to get a much more compressed piece in terms of what exists in our ramified growth that's representing the shape of the tree. So I'm going to continue to work just through this area here and continue to kind of look at those bottom sides. Now I have to make a determination, and when people say clean off the bottom growth, they don't often quantify how far do you go, right? Because when you start to push this up, I could start to say, well, this could be considered bottom growth, and this little piece could be considered bottom growth. We want, over the course of time, as ramification ages, okay, we start out with a design like this, almost on, not 100%, but when we're in the developmental phase, this is our design. Okay, and what we see is that growth phototropically grow towards the light. So it starts to take on this kind of upward movement, right? Nice little from this flat piece here, trying to get my orientation, yep, to now taking on this. And we're cleaning off those bottoms, and we're trying to maximize this. Now, if we clean too many bottoms, what we end up doing is we end up creating growth like this. Okay, and when you get a pad like this, you have to rewire that to lay that out much sooner. So we're cleaning off the bottom to get just that slight uptick. Phototropic effect, that's what we call mochikomi on the pad. This shows age, right? But we don't want to get to here by overly cleaning. So there's a balance to be struck there. There's a middle ground in the cleaning process. And Procumbens is going to be the one that if we over clean, because we make that big action, right? Again, big action means big response. We over clean and we heavily reduce, all of a sudden Procumbens starts growing at a rate that we're like, this has just become a little bit more unmanageable. Cool. Let's refine our cleaning process then. Let's continue to expand our knowledge of how we handle and manage the energy distribution and the growth. And Procumbens is a monster of a very, very strong species. I mean, for a juniper species in general, we talk about strength existing in the foliar mass, but Procumbens has an incredibly, and I would say incredibly abnormally durable root system. They can be worked a little more aggressively. They can be potentially pushed a little bit farther because of just the general strength of the species. And I honestly don't know where that comes from. The compact growth of the Procumbens nana would I think be one area that we could potentially lean on and look as an influence, because the smaller that the leaf mass gets, much the same as the smaller the particle size gets in the containerized environment, then the more compact, right, that root system is going to become. But when we start to talk about the smaller the particle size, the more water it holds and the more oxygen spaces it cuts off. And when you talk about that smaller particle, right, when a particle decomposes or breaks down into smaller pieces, it exponentially, the increase of water holding capacity, the increase of the surface area is exponential. We'll take that and apply that to a needle. Okay, so when you look at a larger procumbens versus a dwarf procumbens, so you're looking at just Juniperus procumbens or Juniperus procumbens nana, the dwarf version. The dwarf version, the stunted variety, smaller needle, with that smaller needle comes an exponentially expanded surface area for photosynthetic productivity, etc. And that's oftentimes where we do see that root system being so impeccably strong. Strength is still coming from the foliar mass, but you've got that foliar mass that becomes so dense, has such an exponentially greater surface area. And I would argue, I would say, if we talk about a scaled juniper and we talk about what is the most photosynthetically efficient shape of the needle, the scale or the needle form of that foliar type, that juvenile form, I would say the juvenile form has a greater amount of surface area, and the juvenile form does have the capacity to photosynthesize more. Now this is where we have to be careful yet again. Okay, because when we start to talk about that photosynthetic capacity being expanded, you would say, well, then why go to the scale form? Well, if you're restricted of resources, okay, you don't have a ton of water, the scale form is going to lend to a lot more durability, because all of a sudden that expanded photosynthetic surface area folds up to that central scale. We reduce the amount of sugars and starches we can produce, but we also reduce transpiration. We also reduce the loss of water. So we see the scale foliage being definitely a comfortable position for a tree to sit in as a means to manage their energy resources. The juvenile form, it's sort of, I need sugars and starches now or I'm going to have a big problem. I will run the risk of transpiration causing an issue. And that's where we see the behavior start to shift. So that's an interesting analysis to just be aware of why does a procumbens have so much strength, and how does that work, to look at that physiology and build a significant knowledge base around the species. Again, we have another reason to love it in the fact that, oh, you've got this photosynthetically efficient monstrosity of a machine, and we can use it to do things that it has not. I don't think procumbens that we've seen the highest level of procumbens yet. I don't think we've even remotely touched the highest level of aesthetics that procumbens can potentially approach. But I am enjoying what's happening with this branch right here as we start to see some of this age reflected in the piece. Now I'm at a point here where I've got this piece hanging down. Let me go ahead and rotate back into the detail. Okay, notice how this piece is hanging down, and then notice if I bring that up, we start to work that in. I've got to make a decision at some point. This is more or less a literati-esque tree that has become much more compact. What happens if I gin that whole piece and I really shrink down that pad? You see that I could push this, and it looked on the detail cam like, well, obviously take it off. But now when you see here the full size of the tree, okay, if we push that up and in and we clean that up, we're going to have a relatively big pad here. This starts to get quite large, okay? But when we start to talk about, okay, so then do we go ahead and kind of pull that off? That almost starts to be a little small. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, all right, we know that we need it. Can I get rid of just a strategic portion like this piece hanging down to lighten that area up? And then can I come back in and can I make it believable, right? In terms of, can I contour the foliage that still exists after that reduction to really make it look like that piece never existed and not have to add wire? Okay, now I recognize with the removal of that branch, I may get a little bit more of a strong response. Again, coming back to the California stream where we were talking about that removal and response, and we decided to cut some branches off, and we said, okay, doing this in the springtime, this is going to catalyze a little bit more of a kickback and a response. I know that. I'm going to accommodate that. I'm going to make sure to check my fertilizer so that I'm not too aggressively fertilizing in addition to the reduction of the foliar mass. Again, strength in junipers comes from the foliage, and this is where we see them really behave. Okay, when we get in here, we get these tall kind of spindly pieces, and as I look in here and kind of move that around, you notice that there's no ramification around that. These are the kind of weak interior pieces, and again, just to, I know the camera has a hard time focusing on that, but that should just paint the image of how lowly ramified that is. No branching on this whatsoever, not even any buds back in and along these areas. And this is a good time to potentially talk about the fact that if we take a Procumbens juniper and we cut back into this stem right here, okay, I just cut that back into that singular stem. There's no bud, there's no secondary ramification, there's nothing in there. There is a chance that there's a bud we have not identified on the stem, but most of the time the growth is going to come back to the base. And even when we look inside of this interior where we remove that weak piece, you see all of this strong growth that's occurring in here that's much more compact and ramified. This is really, when we get a Procumbens built up and healthy, this interior growth that becomes really nice and compact starts to take the resources, and that's what causes those longer leggier pieces to actually self-attrition or self-remove them, not contribute to the system, becomes, self-selective. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Okay, become a little bit more self-selective because those younger, more efficient water conductive pieces, got the hiccups, those younger water conductive pieces start to take over, they ramify, they become compact, and they become a much higher quality foliar type for us to utilize. If I have those interior shoots though, like right here, I've got a really beautiful tight interior shoot. Let me see if I can get in here just a little bit. Okay, it's coming directly off of the top right there. Just a nice little tiny guy. Boom, I'm going to cut back to that tiny guy. I want to save that. Okay, and here you can see it even better. Notice that tiny guy right there? On a Procumbens, to cut back to that absolutely will transition energy. Now, we don't want to do that across the entire tree. We don't want to make those kinds of big, heavy, reductive cutbacks across the entire tree, or that will be that big action that causes a big response. Could a Procumbens juniper handle that? They could. You know, I don't like to say junipers can be cut back that much, but a Procumbens is a very vigorous, tough tree because of that photosynthetic efficiency. Okay, we don't want to do that. And particularly when we get into the refinement process, small actions. Okay, so you can see we've thinned down the profile a little bit. We've created a much sleeker version, which is more proportional to a more literati-ish design. Now I'm onto this, and I think this is when we're going to start to see this compounding action of reduction and cleaning. So again, I'm going to start on the bottoms, and when in doubt, when you get into a juniper, cleaning dead needles and cleaning off bottom growth to start educating ourselves, getting the feel for the tree, understanding exactly what the tree has to offer. There is so much information. The conversation that we have with the tree via the way that we communicate tactily with our hands, exchange of energy if you want to go super woo-woo, which I like to go there sometimes. Okay, so when we start talking about all of these different ways that we interact, the cleaning process is the way that we say hello. We're just familiarizing ourselves with the tree, we're seeing everything that it has to offer, and this is helping educate our process. Okay, now immediately we notice how thick, notice how big this is, and you see how much we shrunk down this. We really decreased that width. This is super puffy, and that's all being created by one singular tuft of growth. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that all the way off. Now this is a vertically growing piece. I'm going to spread these. You can see that growing right off the top there. I don't always promote the removal of vertically growing pieces, okay? But when we start to try and reduce the thickness of this, as the Procumbens does naturally mound and get bigger and bigger and tuftier, and we get these vertical pieces that are so big and strong, we want to take those off entirely and allow the lateral buds around it. Exposure to sun, exposure to light, that's what what really catalyzes the capacity to compress and compact. Over the course of time, we're cultivating that ability. Now, we also get into some of these pieces where they're also tall, but they occur in these alternating junctions, and I can take it all the way down to that lowest junction, and all of a sudden, I've really reduced the height of that. That was as tall as that central piece. Now I've cut it back to some interior junctions. Still ramified, though. I didn't take away, right? When we're talking about this, a lot of times when people are cutting back, they're cutting off the fine branches. When we refine a tree and when we talk about, let me come to here. So when we talk about this structure, I don't want to think that my goal is to reduce these woody pieces here, right? I want to keep those. That is what makes a high-level procumbens when we talk about changing our criteria in the show. The more of this we get, the better. That's where when we talk refinement, we're working at these tips, cutting back to nodes that exist inside of these tips, cutting back to laterally growing pieces or interior, stronger, more compact, highly ramified pieces. Okay, so that notion of how we go about the cutback process when we move from development secondary to refinement is what keeps us in refinement. And we recognize that if we cut back too hard, number one, we cut away progress, we cut away the things that are adding that age and that caliber of quality to the tree, but we're also, when we cut that away, stimulating a growth habit that's not going to allow us to sustainably get to this point. Now, what you should be asking is, or what I'm assuming some people are wondering right now is, okay, great lesson, thanks for teaching me, a little bit too late, cut mine back, I'm going to get a big response, or typically I have cut it back and I do see that big response. How do I slow the tree down, right? How do I get the tree back into that calmer state where I get a much more proportional growth? And that's a really good question to ask yourselves. And this is where we say, okay, we know when we get a tree past that point where it's going to start to behave in that fashion, we're going to go ahead and pull back on fertilizer a little bit, lighten up quantity, lighten up frequency, right? We're going to still deliver balanced water and oxygen, and we're not going to withhold water or resources or anything like that. But we're going to allow the tree to respond in that big way, and we're going to come back very quickly. After that growth hardens or begins to harden, we're going to come back and we're going to have to prune it again. And it's that double hit. Boom, boom. I got it in the spring. I got you back. If I go big or I went too far and it reacts big, I'm going to hit it again. And I'm going to bring it into refinement. I'm not going to allow that big explosion to create those resources. I'm not doing it while it's soft. I'm doing it after it's hardened off, energy positive, but at the very beginning of energy positive, not in energy massively accumulated, and now we're back in the big swing of behavior. Okay, so I'm taking this piece back quite a bit in terms of how much I'm managing it, but you can see in the big picture now, notice how slender that is. Notice how sleek that is. I am saving some interior pieces inside of this so that I have the ability to fill in that interior where, and let me go ahead and rotate this into screen, okay? I have a kind of a hole in here now because I've made some pruning decisions, and I'm going ahead and I'm kind of keeping some of the pieces in here that potentially will start to occupy on the very interior, some small little pieces. Now you'll notice this guy's sticking out here, okay? This is the first piece that I've come to where I actually need to apply a little bit of wire just to give guidance. And we've talked about wire stacking, where we come in and we recognize I don't want to wire any of this. I don't want to wire any of the already defined shape. And in fact, wire oftentimes can take away that natural form that you start to get and are trying to achieve. Now, if you were just wiring this whole thing, you would absolutely be trying to pair this. I'm just going to do this, and I'm just tying off right there, just to a little location. I've got the high branch right here that's sticking up, and I've got this low branch right here. Now, most of us, to get this to be a defined shape, would probably want to wire the high branch down. But the high branch has taken this beautiful arc. Boom. That's that arc that I want. To wire that out of it and flatten this down, that would be an absolute detriment to the shape. So I'm actually going to preserve that. I'm going to carry this wire over to the piece that's down, and I'm going to bring the piece that's down up. Now, that still doesn't solve the fact that this is not, and let me get you to some negative space, this is not inside of that pad. This is why we always want to use the gauge of wire that allows us to move everything. Okay, so I'm going to use the wire back in here at the base before that branch forks, right? I'm going to come back behind that and I'm going to lower the whole thing. That brings the bottom piece down even further, but now that I've wired the bottom piece, and you're gonna see it appear right there, it gives us a little bit of body. Maybe I brought it up just a little bit too much. I wanted you to see it, and then I can go ahead and come back in here and take off that high point, and that is the only piece of wire that I need to apply to that pad. Now all of a sudden, we start to see that sleekness. Notice that sleekness that exists in these two pads, and we start to recognize, oh, okay, yeah, no, this is gonna be quite stunning and very, very minimalistic in the literati-ish sort of spirit. And this is, I think, the far degree of pushing a Procumbens into literati is a really interesting exploration, because literati is supposed to be so sparse, and we're dealing with a species that is so inherently dense. Okay, so now we're going to continue working up into here. And I think you're probably getting the gist of what we're doing with the Procumbens juniper. But really where I, again, want to emphasize and take you through one more round is just the notion that if we cut and where we cut and when we cut, where is too big of a cut that actually would cause. Because to this point, we've been very, very minimalistic. Again, in refinement, I'm taking it into refinement. I'm not doing too much. I'm not reducing too much. This will behave very, very tight and compact with this work right here. I have not triggered any sort of behavior. If I did this across the entire tree, I'm not going to get a big pushback. It's going to continue with that tight, compressed growth. And that's what I want, okay? But if we start to look at this and say, gosh, it really does feel like this is too heavy up in this region particularly, right? We've got these two big branches, and even if I reduce these, that is a lot of foliar load to exist here. I also have an interior pad right here on this drop branch that gives me such interesting character that I would ideally like to potentially add a little bit more quality to. So I'm starting to think, well, what if I take this central piece off? Does that leave behind an interesting gin? Does that leave behind or potentially create the space that I'm looking to achieve? This is also attached to it. I would probably leave that one. That's an option, and that would give rise to this bottom piece. Or I could take off this piece right here and give light to that area. Now there's two branches here, both of them coming from the apical region. I definitely don't need both of them, and I might not even need either one of them. So this is going to be a big action that is going to cause a big reaction. This is going to force me, and I'm going to make this knowing exactly what we need to, what we're trying to accomplish, and knowing how the tree is going to respond. I'm going to go ahead and make that decision. I'm going to make the decision of taking off this lowest piece, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I have such a beautiful dropping branch here that has not just these two pads that we've worked, but it has a third pad here that creates great movement through that undulating piece, right? This is something that I haphazardly created with Ted Madsen at a workshop in his backyard. Back in college, I used to drive down to Pasadena, and Ted would let me sleep in the back of my truck in front of his house to attend his study group. And this tree, when I brought it down to Ted's, this tree was like the pride and joy of my collection. I mean, like, anybody who came into my backyard saw a whole bunch of projects, and then the Procumbens juniper looked like a finished bonsai. I really didn't even do much to it, right? It just does that. And so bringing it down there, I was kind of like telling him, like, I don't know if I really want to reduce it that much. I don't know. I was really resistant to his teaching, and he just told me. He's like, if you want to come here and make bonsai, then make bonsai. Otherwise, don't waste my time. I've never heard Ted say that to anybody, but that was how he explained it to me, and he walked off, and I was kind of looking at the tree, and I was thinking about it, and I just cut one piece off, and then I was like, oh. And then I cut another piece off, and I cut another piece off, and I started seeing this happen, and he came back, and he was like, whoa. Because I went way beyond what we were talking about, not in terms of overly reducing. Whoa, like, wow, you just did that. You just took a big step, brought about a major design through branch reduction. Anyways, it was pretty spectacular, and I don't even know how I got there, but that's where we went with that story. So I'm going to pull back out of my own mental hole, okay? Nice. nice negative space opened up. You see that rhythm, you see this piece here. Again, we got to clean that up to delineate that from this piece, and maybe even potentially look to move this piece a little bit further to the back. We'll come back to that. That space is very, very welcome. I feel like this branch needs to be much smaller, but I do think that I like this branch being here because this is a stake-trained procumbens, and it does come up and form a natural arc right there that is very circular, that is very round, and if I don't break up that circular shape, I think your eye is going to go right there. I've tried to put deadwood in there because of that. I've tried to change the position multiple times. This is the best front for the tree from my perspective, and that is a flaw that exists, that branch is decreasing or distracting the attention to. And what that means is we have to come back up here and start looking at, do we need both of these with the kind of density that they have here? And again, they're both coming from a much bigger branch off of the apex. But I think an argument could be made that we could reduce one of these, and I think the one that we would want to reduce needs to be reduced with a lot of strategy, okay? The front of this tree, let me just make sure, the front of this tree is, okay, it's right in there, okay? So this gives us our flow. Now, when we make that delineation, we understand we've got the base here, live vein there. This becomes a big kick out right here. So we go out, we go in, we go out. This is what we want. If we just took that step and bow, took this off, all of a sudden we would kind of make the apex the kick out, and that feels really, really uncomfortable. To have the apex be this massive cliff, this massive shelf, nothing here, and then defining branch, I don't know how I feel about that. I like, and I definitely want something to exist in this region. So I have this dominant piece in front. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep that dominant piece in front, and I'm going to take out this piece in the back. That creates that push, gives me a little bit more air and takes away some of that. That strategically means I probably also need to start pushing back in the actual apical region itself. But now you see, boom, 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 and I get gin here, I get gin here. I have remnants of what was negative space, increased asymmetry based on that decision. I'm aging the design as I'm making this, and the consequence of it, knowing how junipers are going to react in an energy positive state, is it's going to produce some strong growth in response. Gonna have to come back. Now that you see what action will elicit that strong response, need to come back to this tree, probably in that sort of initial hardening off phase, which based on our spring this year in the Pacific Northwest would be right at the end of May, beginning of June, I think is probably when I would need to come back. Already producing foliar growth, or just getting ready to produce foliar growth. Actually in a month, is it? Yeah. End of May, beginning of June, 4 to 6 weeks I would give it to produce. It's just now starting to push foliar growth. I'm catching this pruning prior to the pushing of that foliar growth. Never want to be pruning once it's started producing until it's actually hardened off and got back in that energy positive. And again, now that I've also elicited that stronger response, I'm going to go lighter on the fertilization. I don't want to feed the beast. When you wake that beast up, doesn't mean that you have to energize it as well. Okay, we know that we've stimulated a very vigorous tree to produce that coarser growth, and we're going to go ahead and calm it down by not adding a tremendous amount of fertilizer. Still going to fertilize, right? Light application, maybe 6 weeks apart, call it good. I don't need moderate, I don't need heavy, I don't need a massive amount of fertilizer, or it really will rage. And again, refinement in general, we are going to be a lot more, I would say, subdued or reserved in our fertilizer application to maintain that refinable capacity. Okay, so I'm going to give you the once around just to see the space that opened up, and I think this is a beautiful space in the design. Yeah, you see that branch kind of having that nice drop movement. Again, this is just a standard stake-trained procumbens where all the branches were dropped down, but 12 years old, you got to hang on to it. It's not Mirai's best tree, but I do have a lot of affection for this tree, and it has continued to give me that quality. You notice the cleanliness of these pieces. You see some of the unworked pieces here. You notice the cleanliness. You see some of the unworked here. I started cleaning up the bottom of this back piece before the stream started. I just couldn't keep my hands off the tree, and that's what gives me this. You notice that if I keep rotating, then you get into a lot more of this kind of sloppiness that exists, okay? And then you kind of see that there's not a whole lot to shout about as we look through some of the other portions of the tree, but we get back here to where we're at. And it does have a lot of charm. It is highly refined. It is starting to show some of the merits. How would I continue to improve this? Follow this process. Now we're talking about time. Okay, I want more woody ramification in here. My feeling is, if you take a tree that naturally has this kind of vigor and this kind of capacity to grow, and you put it in an exhibition and you're judging it objectively, to look at a Procumbens juniper and not pay attention to the ramification, or to look at any of our juniper species and not think about what would happen if you took all the foliage off and just had the ramification. That tree, conifers in general, should have the same ramification in terms of attention to detail of transition to the tip, really beautiful angles and crotches and points of origin and shorter internodes and all of the things that we judge a deciduous tree for. A conifer should have, if all the needles were stripped, it should have the same merits in its ramification as that deciduous model, and Procumbens is no different. And I think we're probably learning the pruning process, preserving those pieces, knowing they're valuable, knowing they're part of the maturation, knowing you don't want to cut too much. Now we're evolving, and Procumbens is going to be able to reach that higher level as a bonsai subject. That's what I got for you. That's what I wanted to talk about. I feel like when we did it with Bsop, there were so many other things, right? It was kind of a broader brushstroke. I saw this opportunity with this tree just getting ready to push as Sam and I were conceptualizing mini streams. This is a species, again, that I think there's more to be had out of it, and getting to really dive into that is the most important piece of evolving our skill set. Josh has a before picture. I just want to bring you back just so we can see the progress that we've made. Go ahead and show us that, Josh, and let me, I'll turn this. Okay, and this just gives us an idea of where we're headed and how we're trying to handle the foliar mass. Okay, so take a good look at this, now bring it back to where we're at, and I think the addition of space contributed dramatically. And even when we start to talk about the tree's gonna have a bigger response, this is still a minimal amount of reduction when we think about the greater scope of this tree. I doubt it's just gonna absolutely explode, but it's a nice transition that we just saw happen. A lot of work to yet to be done, but we got through, I would say, you know, a fairly significant portion. I have a little bit here, I have a little bit here. It's quick work, it's fun work, it's really enjoyable. This is like flow state kind of work to give Procumbens that attention, but give them that attention. Give them what they deserve. Welcome to the Bonsai Mirai YouTube channel, where we educate you on how to do bonsai better and inspire you through creative projects that expand your awareness of the art form. Click subscribe to be the first to know when new videos are added to the channel.